All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Scott. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Sustainability for Acuity Brands Intelligent Spaces Group. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Before we get going, I actually want to share a little bit of a personal anecdote because I think it just hammers home the reason and the value why we're all here today. So I was flying into AHR and I was waiting at the airport, and to kind of spend some time, I was reading the news, and I was really struck by the fact that every single headline was so black or white. It was so A or B. So for example, the real estate section said that 2024 is going to be a seller's market. The next article said 2024 is going to be a buyer's market. Then when I went over to the tech section, it said AI is going to save us all. The next article said AI is going to be the end of all of our jobs. Even the health section had, the vegan diet is a new thing according to Netflix's special, versus the carnivore diet is maybe the way we should all go. I was struck by this because the reality is, and I think we all know, that the truth typically lies not in the black or white, but somewhere in the gray. And this is especially true when it comes to complicated topics. Very complicated topic, and one that we're all trying to collectively solve, is how to decarbonize the economy. More specifically, those of us in this room, we're trying to decarbonize the built space. Probably because we represent 40% of global emissions. So while it's just a small anecdote of me sitting in the airport seeing these black or white headlines, it really made me realize how much we as an industry, we need to understand how to navigate the gray zones of decarbonizing the built space. We need to better understand the risks and the opportunities as we're going to our customers and help support them in this journey. Also, because it's such a big issue, it's not just limited to one kind of role or one kind of industry, which is why I'm so excited for today's panel. We have industry experts from very different backgrounds. So we have somebody with expertise in marketing, somebody in tax incentives, somebody more in project-based, and then we have some cybersecurity considerations as well. So we're gonna, over the next 45 minutes, give you a lot more background so that you feel empowered navigating those more delicate, nuanced conversations with your respective customers. So with that, I'm gonna introduce the panel, or I'm gonna ask the panel to introduce themselves. And you might see John Parmley not sitting at the end. He had a flu that he decided not to share with us. So we have Stephanie Poole, who is a decarbonization engineer, who is also sitting in and can shed some light on key topics today. So Stephanie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. I'm not John. My name is Stephanie Poole. I'm a senior decarbonization engineer. I work for a consulting firm called SES Consulting. So we do mainly energy efficiency and decarbonization design. I also have been researching cybersecurity, so I'm going to speak to you about some cybersecurity concerns. I will not pretend to be an expert.
Thank you very much. Gary.
I'm Gary Graham. I am a retired energy and sustainability expert. I spent most of my career in controls, performance contracting, regulated and unregulated utilities, and most of the last 20 years working with commercial real estate firms through facilities management organizations, Jones Lang LaSalle, and Cushman & Wakefield. So a lot of that time has been, particularly the last 10 years, I've really been working with clients to get their arms around this first part of this. What is my carbon footprint? What does that mean? How do I figure out what it is? And then working on plans and programs to help them reduce that over time, really focusing on their built environment.
Abby.
Hi everyone, my name is Abby Massey. I'm a professional engineer and tax incentives director at a firm called Calvetti Ferguson. We're a traditional CPA firm, but we also specialize in tax incentives that are on the federal level. I started my career as a traditional building design engineer. I spent about 7 years in the industry and then transitioned over to tax incentives. My specialty are incentives centered around energy efficiency and real estate. So many of those incentives require technical analysis from an engineer. Even some of them require certification from a professional engineer. So that's where my background ties in and where I provide my expertise.
And Renee.
Hi everyone, my name is Anisha Mas. I am a software manager at Moderator. under the Integrated Building Technologies Division. I started my career early on as a coordinator on site for building automation, wanting to understand how we could be implementing building automation in installation and commissioning, and then transition into that management. I always had a passion for sustainability, so I wanted to explore what that looks like. That kind of led me to my current role today, where we take a look at how we can merge those two things, how we can get building automation to achieve sustainability goals, to take a look at how feasible decarbonization is and advise our clients of the actions that they can take and how we can guide the industry in doing so.
Wonderful. And as I mentioned at the top, my name is Lauren Scott. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Sustainability at Acuity Brands Intelligent Spaces Group. If you're not familiar with that particular brand name, you might be more familiar with the brands that we have here today. We do have a booth with Distech Controls, and we have the Aegis brand, and most recently Key2 Therm as well. So we sell the software, sensors, and controls within the built space to make spaces smarter, safer, and greener. And I've been with that particular business for coming up on 11 years this year. And it might be a little bit bizarre hearing the title, marketing and sustainability. But when it comes to risks and opportunities, messaging and messaging about what you do in your space is so important. And to illustrate this and to wake you guys up post-lunch, I'm going to ask for a little audience participation, which I know everybody hates. But I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if the following applies to you. So raise your hand if you or your business help your customers save energy or have a positive environmental impact. Okay, great. Raise your hand if you have messaging about this impact, whether it's on your website, social media, brochures, that sort of thing. So most of you. Okay, so now I see people from Acuity giggling at me. Okay, so take off your business hat, put on your consumer hat. When you're out shopping, how many of you, raise your hand, will buy a product because you see it's more environmentally friendly? Some hands. Now, when you're out shopping, raise your hand if you see a logo that says environmentally friendly or eco-friendly or carbon neutral. Raise your hand if you feel a little bit confused or sometimes you don't actually even trust that logo. Okay, about the same amount. So this really hammers home the risks and opportunities when it comes to messaging about decarbonization, sustainability, and the broader industry. Because there are risks and opportunities if you do talk about it, you're doing the right thing, you want to talk about it, but then there's also risks and opportunities if you just don't talk about it. So this is going to be a really quick crash course on the risks and opportunities. So if you do talk about it, which most of you say you're doing good things and you're talking about it, what are the three main risks? The first, we're in the US, it's class action lawsuits. We've seen a number of companies start to be sued for their green claims. The perfect example is Delta Airlines, who was part of a class action lawsuit for using the term carbon neutral with their flights. So I'll get to how you can get around that or maybe be more thoughtful about it, but you have class action lawsuits. The second is civil regulations. 4 days ago in Europe, members of parliament passed a law banning greenwashing and the use of a number of different terms that our industry continues to use, like environmentally friendly, eco-friendly. So this is something that is likely going to be coming our way. So just being aware of the potential regulations that are out there. And the third risk, you guys all touched on it when you raised your hand and you said you're not sure if you trust those claims. So there is a risk around your consumers trusting what you're saying. On the flip side, there's the risk if you don't talk about it. I can guarantee you, if you are doing all these great things and your lawyers tell you not to talk about it, or you're a little bit cautious about talking about it, your competition, who are the smaller players who maybe have less on the line, they're less likely to be the victim, if you will, of a class action lawsuit, they're going to be out there. They're going to be talking about everything they're doing. So your competition might be stealing that limelight away from you. You also might be getting less investors because they are truly looking to invest in those companies making a difference. And then finally, you might also just have that elevated risk in terms of just not being able to attract the talent to your organization if you're not talking about it. They might go elsewhere to take part of a company that is more forward-looking. very quickly, there are three things that you can do leaving this. I want to make sure it's not all doom and gloom. So I've studied this quite closely, and the best thing that you can do is if you're talking about any energy claims, make sure it's extremely specific. All the legislative changes that we've seen are against general broad terms. So don't just say that your company helps make you be more energy efficient. Get very specific on how you do that. So get specific. The second, I've seen a lot of booths talking about how much energy they're saving. They might say up to 30%. Document that process. If you are under any of these investigations, what they will do is say, how did you come up with that claim? So make sure you're documenting that process. And then if you document it and it's not on the back of a napkin somewhere, make sure that it is repeatable. So that's really what you need to do. Get super specific, document your process, make sure it's repeatable. And then finally, if you have marketing teams, this year, the Federal Trade Commission is coming out with new green guides. So you can look those up and share them with your team. And that's basically going to be the Bible for your team to see what they can and cannot say when it comes to sustainability. So as for regulations, I'm going to maybe turn to Abby first because it's not all doom and gloom. There are a lot of opportunities with those risks, especially when it comes to tax incentives. So can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. So right now is a really good time to be pushing towards the decarbonization and energy efficiency because legislation is backing this. For one of the first times ever, we've got a lot of legislation that is enhancing incentives for folks who are pushing towards energy efficiency in their buildings. Not only that, they're incentivizing folks like government agencies or nonprofits who normally don't benefit from tax credits and deductions. They can now actually benefit from some of these programs. So specifically, if you don't know, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in 2022. It has a ton of incentives in there that are all centered around energy efficiency, green buildings, all sorts of technologies that are enhancing this. Some of the programs that are notable are the investment tax credit. You can receive 30% or more of the cost to install certain renewable property, like solar panels or geothermal heat pump systems are a big one, energy storage, combined heat and power. That program specifically has opened up something called elective pay or direct pay. And what that means is if, let's say a K through 12 public school installs solar panels, they can receive the amount of this credit through that program in a check. They would pre-register their project. If it's approved, and they would file something that looks a little bit like a tax return and receive a check from the US Treasury. This is amazing for anybody who's servicing clients like this because this is a program that they normally would completely ignore. So being sure that they know that this exists, that you can educate them on these programs. There's plenty others. Section 45L is for developers of energy efficient homes that are going to be leased or sold. Section 179D is for building owners who are making energy efficient improvements. There's also tax incentives for installing, EV charging stations. There's incentives for going, maybe converting your fleet to electric vehicles. So there's a ton of information out there. Now is really the time to start talking about this, start implementing these types of projects so you can capture these financial tools on the backside.
Maybe just to bounce off of that too, if people in this audience are trying to figure out, okay, well, what is my very first step to guide my customers towards these opportunities?
Yeah, great question. So I'm sure you're all busy keeping up with your own codes. You're probably not masters of the tax code itself. So I would say the first thing you should do is get educated. Find a provider who specializes in these incentives. They will provide education on them. Their goal is to make these programs as easy as possible for you and your customers to move forward with. So they will do webinars, they will have resources so that you can learn about these programs and who of your customer base would benefit from them. From there, partner with somebody you trust who specializes in these types of incentives. They're the ones who will keep up with the rules and regulations. They'll make sure that you have the information you need because you're not the expert in it, and we understand that. We don't expect you to go out and identify the opportunities that are available for these. You can send us the questions and we can help you say whether or not a project would be a good fit for one incentive or even maybe several. In some cases, some of these incentives can be stacked together and be claimed. So that's the first step. Find some resources and education and someone you can partner with who has experience in these incentives.
I have something to add to that, actually. So I work for a consulting firm. I'm a decarbonization engineer, but we do a lot of the marketing side. And kind of our first step when any client is coming to us is to try and decide if there's some incentive program for either a piece of equipment or a study or training and support. Like there's tons of incentives across Canada and America. So I'm from Canada, just for context. And a lot of it's province or state specific, but there are federal ones as well. And so that's always our first step. So a lot of the times, if you're an equipment vendor, the consulting firm has already identified that installing your equipment is going to provide incentives, and they've worked with the client, and so that's kind of done up front. That's typically the first step, I would say, of most consulting firms. And I know there's a lot of federal programs in the works, at least in Canada, to start trying to do this for clients and owners, because that's, they often don't know where to start. I also have one thing to add on a risk if you're not doing that. I don't know if you were going to touch on that.
No, go ahead.
Go wild.
Sure. Okay. So one of the other things, just in terms of there's all these benefits, there's all the incentive programs, isn't that great? But one of the risks of not doing it that we're seeing more and more is penalties, emission limits. And right now, I know that federally in Canada and the US, they're state-based, city-based. There's only very specific ones that have those emission limits in place. But in, say, Australia, that's countrywide. So all of them have these emission limits, and if you're going over them, you're paying penalties, you're paying fines. So, it's great that you're installing a heat pump and you're getting these incentives, and that's a benefit. But a risk is, if you don't, eventually these penalties are going to fall on you, and it's going to end up costing you more.
Thank you for those additions. So when we walk around the trade show floor, we see all of the latest technology. Gary, I'd be curious with your deep experience, what would be what kind of opportunities are out there for those who are willing to embark and take on that latest technology to support their decarbonization journey in the build space?
One of the most important things out of this is understand what's going on from the client standpoint. Us as manufacturers and installers of equipment or engineering firms that are specifying it, we know what it can do, and we know all the stuff down here on how it works and what it does, and here's our feature, function, benefit. The client is buying something else. There's an immediate need in the building that they often know, but it's really looking at understanding where is the client at in their journey for decarbonizing. And so early adopters of technologies, it's an interesting dichotomy there. From a project-by-project basis, people are going to be looking at wanting to do that. I've got something important in my building. But if you're working with a client that's got a portfolio of properties, they're really looking at that as, these are my assets. They're aging. I'm going to have to replace equipment over time. My chillers, my boilers, my air handlers, whatever. I've got regulatory things that are happening, putting pressure on me to make changes and be more efficient in this market, whether it's from emissions or from energy efficiency. So to really understand where they're at and get your foot in the door with their long-term plan, because they're looking at that capital plan across their portfolio. And if you can get somebody who's going to adopt your technology early, you have great success with it, that opens up the door for multiple installations for you across that client's portfolio.
And you briefly touched on regulations, actually Stephanie did as well. What do you view as the primary risks of those regulations coming in and not acting fast enough? Kind of just, let's wait and see, let's just wait, we won't take any immediate action. And it could be at the state level, or even we're seeing at the city level.
Yeah, state, city, and federal. I think you're seeing, in Europe, the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is requiring reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a mandatory, responsible. The Security Exchange Commission here, the SEC, is looking at putting some requirements in for reporting. Again, that can help with the greenwashing side. But then local legislation, in New York put Local Law 97 in place, that's making buildings reduce their emissions by certain amounts by certain dates, or you will be fined. This is no longer just the incentive carrot, There are penalty sticks that are being used out there. Washington, D.C.'s got a program that's really focused on energy efficiency versus the emission side, but they go hand in hand. Boston just passed regulation. Same thing as New York. If you fail to report, you're going to be fined. If you don't meet the emissions levels at those points, you will be fined. California just did a statewide requirement for reporting emissions. So up until the last couple of years, most emissions reporting has been voluntary, and people have been putting together programs. The big technology companies have been doing this, and some of the big banks that I've worked with have been doing this for 15 years, 20 years. They're very mature. You've got hundreds, if not thousands, of mid-tier customers that are all of a sudden something from an investor or their supply chain is saying, I need to do something. And they're not looking at this as a one project in my building, they're looking across our portfolio. So lining up, I think the big thing from the risk out of this is you have to be ready to report. You have to have a plan to reduce and work that plan. And it's not just an incentive carrot anymore. There are fines that you're going to be facing that are sticks. And I worked with a few clients that their portfolio in New York City, if they were not going to meet their goals, were millions of dollars a year. So it's material.
And Raneem, I'm curious in terms of the difference of risks and opportunities when it comes to new construction versus retrofit. Are you seeing any nuances there?
Yeah, I think with new construction, we have so much opportunity to put in systems that we know will be sustainable, that will be energy efficient later on. But the important thing to know is that if we don't put in systems that, one, are easily changeable and maintainable, and we know are tried and true, then we are setting our buildings up to fail. There's so much opportunity, and everybody wants to put in the shiniest, brightest new thing. We need to focus on how easily maintainable is this, and if we need to swap it out at any point, do I have to rip down most of my building to put in this new technology? But in contrast with retrofit is that if we're jumping the gun and saying, hey, I want to just tear everything out, put in the newest technology without doing the studies on how are your tenants behaving, how do your building operators use this technology, are they taking a look at occupancy, at scheduling, and all of these features that could reduce your energy usage by like 30–40% before you even put in the new systems. One, you're not being sustainable in your choices and you're taking these out before you use them until the end of life. And two, the same thing's going to happen when you put in the new systems if you have the same building operators, if you have the same tenants. You're not learning the patterns, you're not understanding why you're having the energy spikes, why your emissions are increasing. So if we don't take a look at it that way and you don't do those studies, it's going to be a cycle that keeps on repeating, and people will end up not believing in like energy efficiency and reducing emissions because they will just see it as not working when it's not actually putting in the legwork.
Yeah, our company focuses mainly on retrofits, and I can say that retrofits are much more complex because you're taking out a wall and all of a sudden there's asbestos and these pipes actually are corroded and there's all these things to consider. But I teach courses on decarbonization, and one of the biggest things we say is energy efficiency first, because if you don't do that first, or you try to just size, like, oh, I had a boiler that was the size, I'm going to put in a heat pump with that same capacity, guarantee you it's oversized, because everything needs to be oversized, because it's cheap to oversize a boiler, it's not a big deal. But to oversize a heat pump, now you're talking double, triple, 4 times the cost. That project is now cost prohibitive, it's not getting done. Or like you said, it's getting done poorly. They're designing, and I've had so many clients like, oh, I got all this money, I want to do this like really cool solar, or this great heat recovery chiller, and they install it. No one knows how to operate it, it's not working. We go into the building a year later, it's been using 3 times the gas that it should. And now these operators are like, well, I hate energy efficiency, it made my life harder, it didn't save us any money, I'm no longer working with a sustainability team. And now you have this extra hurdle that you've just added because you've burnt these bridges with the operators. So it's so critical, especially, you were talking about early adopters. We call those bleeding edge because it's, they're doing it, that's great, but they're also the ones that are encountering like equipment limitations. We had a lot of suppliers be like, oh yeah, our heat pump can run it up to this temperature. Oh, actually, you know what? That's not normal operating temperature, that's maximum, and you shouldn't run it there most of the time. And there are these little things that people are learning in the industry as they go, and that's why it's kind of bleeding edge, because it can go really well, assuming you have a trusted team and you've done, all the steps in energy efficiency first, or it can go really poorly and then it can kind of turn everyone off, and then that's like a whole nother hurdle. I'm encountering that right now with one of my clients where the operations team just wants nothing to do with sustainability, because from their perspective, it makes their life harder, it takes all their money, why would they work with sustainability? So you really don't want to create that.
I might add on that too as well. I think most of you are aware of this, but to piggyback on that thought process, you have to have the systems commissioned. They've got to, somebody has to verify that they're working right. They're as designed, interfacing with the other systems of the building. And then the second part of that is this experiential piece on the client side. We have a lot of building engineers that are my age or within 5 years of myself, and they're retiring, and they know a lot about buildings. And we don't have a huge backlog of folks behind them with a lot of knowledge. So if it's a new technology that's very difficult to operate, you have to make sure you've got the support mechanism, support team in place to train the people that are there and help them as it goes forward. Because that's a fail in the long-term picture. If the buildings aren't performing over time the way they need to.
I actually tell my team our main client is the building operator, not necessarily the building owner, because they're the ones that are going to be pushing this as much as possible, understanding how and why. If the building owner just says, I want my energy consumption reduced by 40%, well, they're going to be like, well, how do I do that? Not understanding that they have all the information, they have all the knowledge to say, okay, I know the schedules, I know the building occupancy is going to be between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. I can save some energy there. I need to understand, is there, there have been studies where they found out that there are leaks in the building that no one is aware of, or that people are exiting bars and walking into their buildings and using all their washrooms and all their energy and everything. People are just taking into that, and nobody knows except for the building operators. So if we don't loop them in and make them the center of the conversation, then we are really setting ourselves up for failure.
To tie it back to the incentives, we have to reflect the design of the building. So if you just drop in a piece of equipment that touts energy efficiency or is new technology, but it's poorly designed, or it doesn't tie well with the existing systems that are going to remain in place, that is going to impact the incentive that you're able to receive in some of these programs. So I completely agree, design is key.
I was going to just add one more thing for commissioning, because I know for us specifically, this is one of those pieces that is absolutely critical. We've had clients install a $2 million heat recovery chiller and then not want to spend that money on commissioning, because for some reason that commissioning piece is like, oh, I don't want to spend that. The $2 million chiller, I got it, it's tangible. I don't want to spend that money to commission. So I feel like, I know there's a lot of vendors in the room. What I would say is I wouldn't sell a product unless I had sufficient money to commission, and we've started doing that now too. I'm like, it's going to require this much commissioning or it's not going to work, and if you're not going to commission it, we're not going to do the project because it's going to fail and then it's going to look bad on everyone. And just one other piece for the operator, I have never seen a successful project where the operator was not engaged. That's like the make or break.
Very good dialogue. Thank you, guys. And to bring it back, you were mentioning there's a lot of vendors in the room. I'm curious for Nima as well. I can definitely speak from Acuity Brands and Biz Tech Controls. We're feeling increasing pressure as a supplier to ensure that we are sustainable within our own operations. It's no longer enough just to sell a product that is sustainable. You also have to look internally and see what we're doing. What kind of pressure are you feeling at Modern Niagara?
It's coming from all over the place. When we see it in bids and spec packages, they're asking us, well, what are we doing internally? How have we avoided emissions? What are we doing for waste management, water management, everything across the building portfolio? What our plan is for decarbonization or getting to net zero. And if you don't have that ready, they're not even considering your bid. And then moving on is when we look at a talent pool. This generation, the upcoming generation, is a generation of socially conscious investors, where they invest their time, their energy, their money, and they are choosing not to work for companies that do not look at net zero and decarbonization. And I think in every panel I've watched today, and some of the series yesterday, they actually, it's it's coming up, the talent pool is sparse, and we're trying to find people that come into this industry and want to change it. No one is going to come in if there isn't movement. We have some big players, and these big players can shift the industry. And we're going to start feeling the pressures a bit later on, but this is going to be one of the main focuses, is that it's coming at us from all directions, whether it's our clients, our owners, our operators, whether it's the talent pool and people working within the company. We've seen so many efforts to try to introduce some sustainability topics, but because it's not built into our general structures, we're seeing it fail in so many places. So if we don't push for it as much as possible, and sometimes you don't get to feel the pressure until 10 years later. We're trying to help our clients kind of jump ahead of that game and say, this legislation is coming. It's a bit more behind in Canada than it is in the States. There isn't as much pressure, but we want to set your buildings up for success later down the line, so you don't have to build a new building now and then invest in all the retrofit 10 years later because your systems aren't equipped for that. It needs to be more like Lego piece of, like, if I need to update something, I need to change it as fast as possible.
You definitely touched on one major risk, which is the labor shortage. Another one is cybersecurity, and it's interesting because leading up to this panel, I had a number of people come up to me saying, why are you talking about cybersecurity and ESG? They're two separate problems. I think that's a really big issue that we're still seeing these as being siloed topics. I'm going to turn to you, Stephanie, and I know, Stephanie, you're putting on this John hat at the last minute. But from your experience, especially in your consulting experience, how do you see cybersecurity and energy efficiency, decarbonization, and probably most importantly, kind of reporting overlapping with one another?
Yes. Hello, I'm John now. I mean, the biggest interaction, I would say, is like to do energy efficiency, I need data. I can't optimize your building if I don't have trending. I need, a year of trending. I don't want a day of trending. I need a year of trending. And I need points. And I need to be able to look at the building and how it's operating. And in order to do that, typically you're a building automation system. Often you're a cloud-based building automation system. You're sending, receiving points, data. People are logging in remotely. Cybersecurity risks are inherent with that. So they're so interlaced that I can't even fathom them being different, because as soon as you're collecting data and sending data to a building, you're introducing risks. Every IT point is a potential failure point. So we have a lot of, I'm working with a university right now, and we're doing metering for all of their systems, and IT won't let us put any of them on the network. We're not allowed to touch the IT network. They have to be hardwired. We have to go through all these tunnels. It's been a huge nightmare, but IT is like, I'm not having that cybersecurity risk. So, anything you want to do, whether it's metering, like actual data, electricity, gas, or whether it's taking a point, watching a motor, watching a chiller, that's all introducing cybersecurity risk. And it's something that I have polled a few experts on, and I think the biggest thing that anyone has said to me is just thinking about it up front, because most of the clients I work with, unless they're hospitals or someone who has been thinking about this for a while, they have no idea. They don't know who's accessing their system, all their passwords are the same, they don't know what all their points are. I did poll a cybersecurity expert, and he said there are 3 questions that he asks. Firstly, what are all your points? What data points do you have? Because a lot of the time they're like, oh, I don't actually know. I think I only have the chiller and the boiler on the VAS, but in fact, it's like I have every single VAV. Every single one of those points is a potential failure point. The second question is, how are they connected? So understanding, is this just connected in a small network, or is it connected outside? Are we data point to data point to cloud to cloud, all of these are potential failure points. And the third question, which I can forget, was who has access? And he was just saying that, granting different access, giving permissions to only those who need it, and looking at only the points that you need. It's really common that I'll go into a VAS and every single point is metered. And that's lovely, but I don't need every single point. I need certain points to do my job, and if you can limit those points, that's less failure points, that's less risk. So those were the recommendations.
If If I can just jump in, I think there's a huge impact that that's causing is because people are looking at it saying, oh, cybersecurity, there's too many considerations, I don't want to dive into it, and that's causing us to go backwards in terms of gathering the data and the analytics and understanding your building consumption, so people are really taking 2 steps back and saying, I don't want to touch it, I don't want to understand it, I've heard so many bad things, and I don't know where to get the access from, and there's so many different obstacles, but I think the important thing to remember is that they are uncomfortable conversations that we need to have in order to understand where do we sit, where are we, and what is it that exactly that we need to do. You don't need to give access to your entire system and expose your entire network. There are ways to get around it, but the important thing is to still have the willingness to have the conversation and take that step forward.
And I would be remiss, Stephanie, to have a decarbonization engineer on the panel and limit you just to cybersecurity questions. What other risks and opportunities are you seeing with your customers that maybe we haven't touched on just yet?
You know, we've kind of talked about a lot of the big ones because we are doing a panel tomorrow, and I'm trying not to like duplicate it because they're different lenses. But the biggest risk, I think, is doing it wrong, and the biggest opportunity is doing it right. And I currently am actively working with 2 clients who represent like the polar opposite of doing it very, very wrong and doing it very, very right. So the one that's doing it very, very wrong is spending, you know, they're getting all these incentive programs and they're getting all this money and they're checking their boxes because they have goals and they have targets. You know, they have to save this many kilowatt hours and this many gigajoules, and they did a study and they implemented it and they checked the box, yay. And then I go into their system literally 3 weeks later and their operators have overridden things, have changed the set points because so-and-so complained, and this classroom needed to have a special schedule that never got reverted. And so they're thinking of it in this discrete, like I checked a box, as opposed to a continuous vision, which I think is, they are a client that I have seen spend probably more than any other client, and yet they have been completely unsuccessful because they don't have the buy-in from the operations team and the sustainability team working together, and because they're not looking at it consistently. So I would say that would be the biggest risk, is like you're wasting all this money, you're doing things wrong, and by doing things wrong, your operators are losing faith in this, and a lot of people are losing faith in like low carbon technology as it fails. But the biggest benefit, I have another client who, you know, they have probably 20 fully electric buildings, they implement air source heat pumps, heat recovery chillers, like big complicated systems. They're amazing. Working with them is a dream. You know, I want to make a change on the control system. I talked to the operator and the control system specialist, and we're all working together. And then it's like, oh, there's a complaint. What could it be? And we kind of brainstorm together, and we're collaborative and we're working well. And you know, we're featuring them for a project. And we just did a video for BC Hydro, which is like a utility company in British Columbia, because they're doing amazing things. They're piloting new projects, they're installing new technologies, and it's going well, and they're saving money, and they're making a name for themselves. Like, we just got them net zero certified, which they can put on their website, and it's really cool. So risk, do it wrong, everyone loses faith in low carbon technology, and operators will never work with sustainability again. That's very extreme, but like, you now have another hurdle. Or doing it right, you're saving money, you're making a name for yourself, and you're making efficient, well-designed buildings.
Well, good luck with that bad client.
Thank you.
So we just have a few more minutes. I am a self-proclaimed sustainability nerd, so I'm just going to keep on running with questions, but I do want to open it to the audience. You can raise your hand at any time. I see one back there.
Yeah, so we built, from the IT side, that possible. We built a couple decarbonization applications after people did it wrong. And so in terms of end users, I know our customers are having a really hard time with adaptability because, you know, in actually using it from like a field level because they were burned so bad. So maybe this is more of a marketing question, like how do you reestablish that trust after that's been done?
What has the messaging been thus far? It was just from the initial
Yeah,
launch.
so specifically it's I mean it's technically a government incentive that is unfortunately kind of the past use case was just the checkbox, right? And now it's that people are asking for more, and then they were given more from an application base, but they're not utilizing it, you know. So we're giving them what they wanted. Use case, user personas have been defined. We know the user experience is easy to use, but how do you navigate that, like that message?
I think it comes back to what I started off the top with, which is that for complicated topics like this, that it's not black or white, you need to find a forum where you can have a slightly more nuanced conversation. So if you're trying to think of different mediums you could use, maybe it is like an interview style video that your team can put up. I definitely also think there's value, if there is a problem, make sure you also have an alternative solution. So if you're working on something in the back end saying, we've tried this, this was the problem, this is how we addressed it, and this is where we're at, I would definitely recommend more of that long form, because it's not just A or B. You really need to figure out how you can package that up, and it's going to be probably better digested that way as well. And it shows transparency. That whole distrust around messaging is because we feel like we don't really know if we can trust those messaging out there. So if you can tell that full story, I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of value.
Who is it that you're trying to get to use it?
So in this specific instance, it's a little bit more in the agricultural space. So it's a lot of kind of like VAS field techs, but in the ag space, who are traditionally kind of in the farmer space, which are not ESG nerds. Like that's not the target group that we're marketing to. So it's yeah.
I know this client that is not doing very well. We actually tried to roll out a fault detection system for them because we were like, oh, it would be so nice. It would, do this continuous monitoring. And the vision was, well, the operators will look at it, they'll use it, then they'll action this. But that was not the case. They didn't look at it, partially because they didn't have time and they didn't have the expertise and they didn't want to learn new things because in a lot of those places they're strapped. So the recommendation was to either outsource who is actually looking at that and have that as part of the service. And I know a lot of the fault detection, they won't sell directly to a client. They will sell to a distributor who's then in charge of taking those alarms and faults and notifications and actioning them, or to have someone in-house whose specialty is to look at that. Because no matter how hard I've tried, some of them just they don't want to learn the new technology, they don't have time, they've been burned in the past. You might just need someone new to actually look at it.
See one more question in the back there.
Hi, I know we're talking a lot about buildings in general, but what about specialized spaces such as data centers or healthcare environments, laboratories? What kind of trends do we see with that? Because they are huge energy hogs, but there is that balance between safety and also comfort.
I can maybe just weigh in quickly on at least the data center space. In working with a number of different critical facilities and data centers, the beauty is it's a vertical that wants to self-regulate. They want to get ahead of any governmental regulation. So we're actually seeing a greater openness in terms of trying to get ahead of ESG regulations and energy efficiency. So it's a bit unusual because they are, in fact, largely kind of energy hog industries, but they're also trying to be very conscious of getting ahead of any regulations. They would much rather self-regulate than have them imposed. So it's actually interesting to see that they're the first ones. I mean, Amazon with the climate pledge, right? I think that's a perfect example of they knew that they needed to be able to communicate and take those first steps. But I would definitely welcome any other input from the panel.
Okay, yeah, I'll weigh in because we do data centers and hospitals a lot, as well as offices and other commercial buildings. And I think when I approach a data center or a hospital, it's a little bit different in that there's less maybe on the energy efficiency side, because sometimes with energy efficiency, you make sacrifices. It's like we're cutting the schedules, where there's a lot of in a hospital, doing a scheduling project is huge because it's like, oh, this one's 24/7 and it serves the same area as this, which is 9 to 5, and sometimes they come in, but sometimes they don't, and there's just a lot of limitations there. So we look at other bigger opportunities, like a lot of data centers, it's heat recovery. We've done a couple of heat recoveries with data centers, and they have good paybacks. Like financially, it's, you know, a 10-year payback. It's actually like a decent project, whereas most decarbonization projects are not good paybacks. So if there's a good heat source like that, and especially in hospitals, you know, like the cleaning rooms and all the dishwashers and all of those, like there's a lot of heat. So just reusing some of that as opposed to sticking to the really straightforward, like I'm gonna do demand control ventilation, I'm gonna do scheduling. Like some of those are trickier to do in really complex and high consequence spaces. So to do what you can with some of those other opportunities.
Great, we have 1 more minute, it's a quick one.
Yeah, so this is mostly for Gary. So comparing a approach for big portfolio owners that, like a business model that would reduce the upfront cost for the owner and kind of pay the contractor back from the savings. Is that something that you've seen a lot of traction?
The typical performance contract in the ESCO services business, I think is what you're asking about.
Yeah.
It's been very successful in the MUSH market, municipal, schools, healthcare, university. I've seen more industrial clients being interested in it today. Again, I've been doing performance contracting since the 1990s, and it was like, okay, it failed typically because is it enough zeros for the CFO to get involved with it, and then legally, what is the contract? This is not easy stuff to get contracted. But I was discussing and working with a lot of our corporate outsourced facilities and saying, look, you are facing this. This is a plan and a program now. You're not doing a project. Should you start looking at financing these? And there was a bit of a shift mentally in even financial institutions, tech companies that are saying, well, yes, I can look at it. They tend to have cash too, so there isn't as high of a need there, but there is an opportunity for self-funding finance projects. I would say the MUSH market, the public sector has been much more successful than in the private sector.
I want to thank everybody for your engagement today. I mean, I think all the questions showcase how interesting this topic is, that it's a very vast topic. We know it's a big problem. There are clearly risks, but there are a ton of opportunities. So hopefully you're leaving this session understanding a little bit more about the different areas, because ultimately that's what we need to all have, is have those more nuanced conversations with our customers, how decarbonize the economy through build space. So thank you very, very much. Thank you all to all of our panelists.